Today we're going to start the digestive system. The digestive system is basically going to be made up of what's known as the alimentary canal, and it has its accessory organs that go with it. So first off, let's talk about digestion. Digestion simply is going to be the mechanical and chemical breakup or breakdown of food and the absorption of this food into the body. Now, when you think of the alimentary canal, you're going to think of an opening that starts at the mouth, and it's almost going to be like a tube that runs the entirety of the body, and it's going to exit at the anal canal. Now, the food that you have that goes in through this area, through the mouth, is going to actually go in, become digested, broken up. You're going to absorb the nutrients, but that food is never actually going to enter part of your body. I often refer to it to students as think of yourself almost like a big Twinkie or a donut that has an open canal that goes through the center of it, and whatever you put in through the center, it can be absorbed into the tissue that's surrounding that center, but that actual substance that goes in through the center never actually makes it into the part of the body unless it can be broken down small enough to be absorbed through the intestines. Okay, and then so talking about that canal, first it starts at the mouth, then goes to the pharynx, which is going to be the throat, the esophagus, which is going to be the food tube that carries it to the stomach. Then from the stomach, it goes to the small intestine, which we'll talk about the three parts, and then we'll talk about the parts of the large intestine before it makes its last way out through the anal canal. Now, the accessory organs we're going to discuss are going to be the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Now, looking here, here's a diagram of the digestive system. So we're going to start at the mouth. With chewing up food, the mouth is going to release saliva. Now, it starts at smelling the food and at tasting the food, because once you smell and taste that food, those salivary glands are going to pick up on the chemicals that are in that food and start to release saliva. That saliva is going to be able to start to break down different carbohydrates that are going to be in that food with the amylase. So the saliva enters, you chew it up, you break it down into smaller portions, you mix it around with the saliva, you get it nice and moistened and lubricated, as well as breaking down some of those carbohydrates. Then you're going to swallow. Once you swallow, it's going to go into the pharynx. Now, the pharynx can be broken down into three specific parts. You have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Now, we talked about the pharynx and with the respiratory system. That is going to be a shared pathway between food and air and the liquids that you will take in. And so in the case here, we're simply talking about the food and the liquids, which is going to come in through the pharynx after you've chewed it up, and then it's going to enter into the esophagus. From that esophagus, it's going to go down to the stomach. Now, lining the pharynx and the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines is going to be smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, remember, is going to be under involuntary control. So the nervous system will control it. You do not tell it what to do. You don't control it mentally. And so with this smooth muscle, it's going to move in rhythmic wave-like motions, which are referred to as peristalsis. So you need to know the term peristalsis. That's a rhythmic wave-like motion that moves things along through the pharynx, through the esophagus, and even through the stomach and the intestines until it exits out during a fecal movement. Now notice going into the stomach, you're going to have a specific spot right here. We see it circled. That is referred to as the cardiac area of the stomach. Now at the bottom of the esophagus, you're going to have a sphincter. A sphincter is going to be a circular muscle, which is going to allow it to close off to not allow backflow or things to go back up through an area that it just came from. So once a food exits the esophagus and goes into the stomach, that cardiac sphincter will close itself off. In the bottom, you're going to notice that there is a pyloric sphincter in the pyloric section of the stomach. The pyloric sphincter is going to be much stronger. This actually, if you're doing a dissection of a pig, you're going to feel this section and it's going to kind of feel like a gumball because that muscle is so strong. It also will close off the small intestine to the stomach. So once the food enters the stomach, both of these sphincters are going to close off tightly, and then the stomach is going to move around and mix the food in with different things such as hydrochloric acid and pepsin, or it turns into pepsinogen, and it's going to be breaking this food down even more into what's known as a liquidy substance called chyme. Now, with the cardiac sphincter, it's not going to be nearly as strong as the pyloric sphincter. And if you have something on your stomach that doesn't agree with you, or you're sick and have an upset stomach, if you were to throw up or regurgitate that food, then that cardiac sphincter is going to open up as the muscles that are in the stomach contract to push that food out of the stomach and then out of the body. Exit drawing. Sorry. Now this is looking at a cadaver stomach, and so you would see, or digestive abdominal cavity, and so you would see these same organs and how they're actually laid out. Now coming back to this picture, notice with the stomach over top of it, you're going to have the liver. The liver is going to be important because it's going to make bile, and that bile is going to help to break down fatty substances within the body. And so once it makes the bile, it is then stored in the gallbladder, which then releases it into the first section of the small intestine coming off the stomach, which is the duodenum. And so it's going to be a little straight piece right through here. So that's your duodenum, or the first section of the small intestine. Underneath the stomach, you might be able to see this yellow organ here, and that's going to be the pancreas. The pancreas is going to be, its main responsibility will be making things such as insulin, which helps to get the sugars that's in the blood from the food into the tissues and feed those tissues. Once you exit through all of the small intestine, like we said, there's three parts. There's the duodenum, the middle section is the jejunum, and then the last section is the ileum. It will then enter into the large intestine. And that large intestine will go up, and then it goes around through the transverse, and it comes down through the descending into the sesamoid, and then into the rectum. And then it will exit out through the anus. And so looking again, here is your cadaver, so you can see how these different organs, you can see the liver, you see the gallbladder underneath, you can see the colon and the small intestines in between in the center. That stomach's kind of smushed in there between the liver and the intestines that you see. So it's not exactly as what the drawing looked like, but this is more of what it looks like inside of the human abdomen. First, let's talk about the peritoneum. The peritoneum is going to be divided into the parietal peritoneum, which is going to face the wall of the abdominal cavity. And then you have your visceral peritoneum, and that's going to be the covering over some of those digestive organs. It's also known as the serosa. Now this covering is going to pack everything nice and neatly into the abdominal cavity. It's going to be very important that this remains intact. When they used to go in and do open surgeries, they would have to open up the abdominal cavity. Lots of times when they do this, of course, they have to open up that peritoneum, and any type of microorganism in the air could have gotten into it, and it could cause an infection known as peritonitis, because inside of that peritoneal cavity, it's going to be completely sterile. Unless one of those organs becomes infected and then it bursts, then those microorganisms that cause the infection can then spread to the other abdominal organs, but for the most part, the peritoneum is going to be sterile. So the peritoneal cavity, like we said, is going to contain a lubricating fluid, and that is a serous fluid, which lines between the parietal and visceral membranes. The peritoneum is going to contain large folds that are going to kind of weave between the organs. It's going to bind some of these organs to each other, so everything's not just kind of flopping around in there. It's all nice and neat and tightly packed in. They contain many blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels, and this will be important because it needs to be able to feed these tissues. It also needs to be able to sense what's going on with these organs and tissues and provide lymphatic vessels in order to fight off any type of infection or microorganism or parasite even that might make it into these digestive organs. Now, the major folds within the peritoneum are going to be known as the greater omentum. That's the largest fold, and it's going to cover the transverse colon, small intestine, and it's going to be responsible for what's known as the beer belly because it has adipose tissue to it and it can grow in size. You have the falciform ligament, which is going to attach the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. You have the lesser omentum. This is going to connect the stomach and the duodenum of the small intestine to the liver. And then you have what's known as the mesentery. The mesentery is going to bind the jejunum and ileum of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. And so this can store large amounts of adipose tissue here. And so that's why you see a lot of belly fat or abdominal fat in this area, because it can do this. Now with the mesentery, this would be the section that if you were looking at the intestines, let's say we go back to the pig dissection. If you're looking at the intestines and you're trying to straighten them out, you notice how they don't like to straighten out. They're nice and tucked in and held together. It's this mesentery that's holding it together. And that mesentery has lots of blood vessels. So it has arteries, it has veins, and then it also has a lot of lymphatic vessels there in order to be absorbing this nutrients, to be getting rid of the waste, to be delivering oxygen to the tissues that's doing the work. And of course, also with the lymphatic vessels, there to fight any type of microorganism or parasite that might be there. So here, looking at that falciform ligament that's going to go through, and it's going to divide the liver there into a right and left half. You see the stomach is underneath the liver. You see the transverse colon going across, and notice how that greater omentum, which is going to be an adipose tissue with connective tissue attached, that's going to be going over top of the intestine. So it's kind of going to be like a nice little separation, or a nice area that's going to be able to insulate that section. However, it can get more adipose tissue there and give you kind of a fat abdominal area or a fattier area. Now here's looking at it with a cadaver again, and notice how you can see the different organs there, and notice how that greater omentum is going to be attached there right at that transverse colon. Now here's a nice picture of the liver. You're going to see both lobes of the liver. You see the nice gallbladder that's going to be attached underneath. Remember, that's going to store bile. So the liver makes bile, which is going to be an emulsifier of fats. It breaks fats down into smaller particles that are then able to be processed and used by the body. It gets stored in the gallbladder. And here is going to be your falciform ligament. Now that falciform ligament is going to help attach to the wall of the abdominal region, and it's actually going to be a leftover rudimentary ligament that was once part of the umbilical arteries and veins that were there, that were attached in. And so looking here, notice how they were able to lift up the liver, so you can see that gallbladder underneath, and then you can see that lesser omentum that's attached between the liver and the stomach there. This is lifting up that greater omentum, so you can see all of the abdominal organs that are underneath. So you notice that transverse colon, which is going straight across, that's going to be part of the large intestine. So you need to be able to interchange the word colon and large intestine, because they will mean the same thing. This also shows the jejunum. It shows that mesentery tissue that's keeping all of these small intestines together. Shows you the ileum as it's being pulled laterally. That sigmoid colon, which is going to be the colon that kind of goes across to the side before it turns to go downwards towards the anus. There's going to be 6 essential activities when you're talking about taking in food and digesting food and processing it. And so the first step is going to be ingestion. This is going to be food intake into the digestive tract. Next, you have propulsion. That's movement of the food through the alimentary canal, and that's going to be done through things such as swallowing and then peristalsis from there. Mechanical breakdown is going to help increase the surface area of ingested food, so you do that from chewing and then from churning and segmentation of that food once it reaches into the stomach. Digestion is where enzymes are going to be secreted into the lumen. Remember, a lumen is going to be any opening in a tube, and that's going to help to break down that food even further. Then you're ready for your body to start absorbing that food. So we have absorption. That's going to be the movement of digested food from or through the mucosal cells into the blood or the lymph. And the last step is going to be defecation. So this is going to be the elimination of indigestible substances that didn't get absorbed or processed or used within the body. So what's left over, the main hard portion or large portion of that, is going to exit the body through defecation. Now the alimentary canal is going to be a muscular tube that can contract to mix food, and it can contract to propel food. So propelling movements are going to be called peristalsis. The structure of this tube is going to be similar along in its length, but does very slightly different things according to the job or what portion it's in. So let's say if it's part of the esophagus, its job mainly is going to be to lubricate and move that food down to the stomach. If it's part of the stomach, its job is going to be to mix it in with hydrochloric acid and with different enzymes in order to break that food down into a mush so it can be processed and used better, known as chyme. If it's going to be part of the small intestine, that's going to be done to add more enzymes in and then used for absorption of nutrients. Once it makes it to the large intestine, there it's going to be mixed in with some bacteria like E. coli, which will help make vitamin K. But then that's going to be the section also that's going to reabsorb water. So the longer it stays in the large intestine, the more constipated you may become. The less time it spends in the large intestine, the more liquidy it might be, so you might end up with diarrhea. Now, the 4 basic layers of this mucosa sometimes are going to be referred to as the tunics, would be the mucosa, which is the innermost moist epithelial membrane. So this is going to line the entire digestive tract. Its job is going to be to secrete, absorb, and to protect. Next, underneath that, you're going to have what's known as the submucosa. It's going to be moderately dense connective tissue. In that, it's going to contain the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels, and we'll also find some nerve fibers. Next, you have what's referred to as the muscularis externa. That's going to be made up of smooth muscle, which is responsible for moving things along in a process or motion known as peristalsis. And then on the outermost portion, you have the serosa. That protects the outer layer of the visceral peritoneum. And so this is looking at those different layers. And so with the intrinsic plexus, you're going to know that you have your myenteric nerve plexus and your submucosal nerve plexus. This is going to pick up on what needs to be done, also send electrical signals to the muscles to let them know that they need to move or start a peristalsis movement. You see that you have glands. These glands are going to secrete different types of fluids. It could be a lubricant or it could be an enzyme. Within that mucosa, you have the epithelium, which is going to be the skin tissue. You have the lamina propria, and you have the muscularis mucosa. Notice within that submucosa, you're going to have that layer. So you also see that you have arteries, you have veins, and you have lymphatic vessels, which are the green. Going into the muscularis externa, notice that you have longitudinal muscle and circular muscle. And then into the serosa is going to be epithelium. It's going to have connective tissue. Below that, you'll see that lumen, which is going to be the opening or tube going through. And then you see the lymphatic tissues, which are going to also be referred to as the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or the MALT. M-A-L-T. All right. So when you're eating, the process of moving this food along will be what's known as the initial state. You have the food, comes in through the mouth, it needs to make its way towards the anus. First thing, you're going to have that contraction after you bring it in. That contraction will then push it along. And that contraction then goes in that wave-like motion, which is peristalsis, till it makes it to the end. Here is going to be another view of looking inside of the alimentary canal, and it shows you different things that you can see. Notice how that you have your finger-like projections that are going to run along the inside part. That's going to be very important because it's going to increase surface area. And what you can't see there on those finger-like projections, you're going to have even smaller finger-like projections. So those are villi that you can see, but if you were to zoom in, you would have even smaller finger-like projections called microvilli. And those are going to increase the surface area even more. So the more surface area you have, the better ability you are to be able to absorb the different nutrients and things that are going to be in the food that are passing through this alimentary canal. Also notice your different glands that are there, and how they have openings in order to release their substances into this alimentary canal. So starting here with the mouth. The mouth is going to be the first site of both mechanical and chemical digestion of food. The cheeks and lips are going to help to hold the food in as you're chewing. The tongue is going to help produce lingual lipase, which is going to be an enzyme which will help break things down. And it's also going to be there to help you move that food around in your mouth and push it against the teeth in order to help you chew that up. The palate's going to be the top portion of the mouth, which will also help hold the food in and shape it. Tonsils will be towards the back of the oral cavity, and they're there to become exposed to any type of microorganism that might be coming in through the food or through the drink that you're bringing in order to exhibit it or introduce itself to that microorganism so it can make a way to attack it later on if it has too many of this microorganism come into it. The teeth, of course, are going to be there in order to grind and tear the food apart. And then your salivary glands are going to produce and secrete salivary amylase, and that's going to help to begin digestion of carbohydrates and starches and things like glycogen. So looking at the surface of the tongue, you'll see that it has papilla, or these little projections. You have that epiglottis that you see in the back. That's going to cover the trachea to keep food from going into the windpipe so it stays in the esophagus. Coming on down, you see that you have palatine tonsils. Coming down further, you see that you have lingual tonsils all the way at the back section of the tongue. And then coming on in, you will see that you have your different sections of the tongue. Now with the falciform, that's going to be the whitish portions of the tongue. It's going to give the tongue its roughness and provide friction, and it does not actually contain taste buds. So that's going to be towards the front. The fungiform is going to be the reddish, which is scattered all over the tongue, and that's going to be the portion of the tongue that does contain taste buds. The valate are going to be the V-shaped row in the back of the tongue, and it also contains taste buds. And then last you have the foliate. That's going to be the lateral aspects of the posterior tongue, and those as well also contain taste buds. So those are the ones that you'll be able to taste with. Now looking at the opening of the mouth, of course you have two lips. You have an upper lip and you have a bottom lip. The opening between the upper lip and the bottom lip, if you were to pull the lip down against the gum line, is going to be referred to as the vestibule. You have a hard palate behind the teeth. That's going to be the upper portion of the mouth. Going further behind the hard palate, you have what's known as the soft palate. You have what's the little hangy-dangy thing in the back. That's the uvula. And so that, as you swallow, keeps the food and drink from going up towards the nasal area. Next, you have your palatine tonsils that are shown back on each side of the throat. Then the tongue. Then you show the lingual frenulum. That's what's going to attach that tongue towards the bottom. And then, of course, the vestibule of the bottom portion of the lip. Major salivary glands are going to produce most of the saliva, and they're going to lie outside of the oral cavity. You have what's known as the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual. Minor salivary glands are going to be scattered throughout the oral cavity and augment slightly. So looking at these, you'll see that the grainy looking or the rough bumpy looking tissue will be glands. It's always going to be glands. In this case, if you look over to the right hand side, you see that large one in the cheek right in front of the ear is going to be your parotid gland. Then looking below, underneath where the chin would be or the jawline, you're going to see the submandibular. And then underneath the tongue section, you will see the sublingual gland. And so those are going to be your major salivary glands there. Functions of saliva is that they're going to cleanse the mouth. So about every 20 minutes after you've eaten something, if you give it about 20 minutes, within that 20-minute period, your mouth will be fairly cleaned out and washed out. That's why it's important if you're drinking some type of soda or soft drink, something with a lot of sugar in it. If you're constantly sipping on that throughout the day, your mouth won't be able to clean itself out properly because it's constantly being bathed in this sugary material, and it could actually lead to cavities and the breakdown of your teeth. However, if you only eat certain periods of the day, only drink during certain times, then the mouth has the ability to kind of wash itself out, clean itself out, and get rid of the sugar so it's not being constantly exposed. The saliva also is going to help in with dissolving food and chemicals for taste. It helps to moisten the food and compact it into what's known as a food bolus. And it begins the breakdown of starch with enzymes that are released. The composition of saliva is going to be anywhere from 97 to 99.5% water, but it's also made up with buffers to help keep the pH around 7, which is going to be neutral. It also contains electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chlorine, and different things like that. You have your salivary amylase and lingual lipases, which are going to come in and start to break down those carbohydrates. You have mucin. You're going to have metabolic waste like urea and uric acid, and you're going to have the lysozyme antibodies and defensins, which are going to be there to help protect against microorganisms and destroy those as they come into the body. Right, so along with making the saliva, you make about 1,500 milliliters a day. Major salivary glands are going to be activated by the parasympathetic nervous system when either the ingested food is going to stimulate the chemoreceptors and the mechanoreceptors in the mouth, or the salivary or salivatory nuclei in the brainstem is going to send impulses along the parasympathetic fibers in the cranial nerves, which are going to be the cranial nerves 7 and 9. Or the strong sympathetic stimulation could also inhibit salivation and result in what's known as a dry mouth. Teeth are going to be important because they're going to be the main components that are going to be there to tear and grind the food for digestion. You will have 20 deciduous teeth that will erupt between 6 and 24 months of age. Now, deciduous is going to be kind of like the deciduous trees. Think about how they grow their leaves and then those leaves fall out. So same thing with the deciduous teeth. Often these teeth can be referred to as milk teeth. So if you ever hear of milk teeth, that will be the deciduous teeth. And those are going to be the 20 teeth that will fall out. The roots become resorb. The teeth will fall out between 6 and 12 years of age, and then you have your permanent teeth, which will come in. The 32 permanent teeth are going to be there to all but the third of the molars by the end of your adolescence. Those molars towards the back will start to come in between the ages of 17 and 25, and sometimes they don't erupt at all. And so these would be like your wisdom teeth. So looking here at the mouth, you can see how the deciduous teeth are out, and then you can see the permanent teeth that are going to be behind them that will push them out. Here's looking at the deciduous teeth, or those milk teeth again in a child. Notice the ones that are in the front are going to be referred to as the incisors. So you have 2 central incisors towards the front, and you have lateral incisors towards the side. Next, you have your canine tooth, or what's referred to as the eye tooth sometimes, followed by the first molar and then the second molar. Coming down to the permanent teeth, you'll see the different ages and things that'll come in. So with the incisors, those are going to be your chisel-shaped cutting teeth. You'll see the canines, which are going to be fang-like teeth that can tear or pierce. You have premolars, or sometimes referred to as bicuspids. These are going to be broad crowns that have rounded cusps. These are going to be used to grind and crush. And then, of course, you have your molars, which are towards the back. These will have the very broad crowns and rounded cusps, and those are the best grinders. Going into the different parts of a specific tooth, it's going to be topped with the exposed part, which is referred to as the crown. The crown's going to be above the gingiva. The gingiva is the gum. It will be covered by a substance known as enamel. That is the hardest substance within the body. It's going to be made up of calcium salts and hydroxyapatite crystals, which make up your bone. Enamel-producing cells can degenerate when the tooth erupts, and there is going to be no healing if there is a decay or crack. So that enamel does not replace itself. Now, they are looking into specific substances now, which is something that's new, that are able to redeposit these minerals on the teeth, and they say that they're able to kind of sort of help heal this enamel now. So as far as I knew, me growing up, enamel, once you lost it, it was gone forever. But now there might be a way to put this back on. They're actually researching it and looking at different products now. Next, we have the neck of the tooth. It's going to connect to the crown and the root. So that's going to be the in-between portion. So that crown and root get connected through that neck. And then the root portion is going to be embedded within the jawbone. Dentin is going to be the bone-like material that's going to be found underneath the enamel, and sometimes that's what becomes exposed after the enamel's worn off. The pulp cavity is going to be surrounded by that dentin. It is going to be made up of connective tissue, and this is where you're going to find your blood vessels and nerves. So if there's an infection, lots of times it's going to happen within this pulp cavity. A root canal is going to be where that pulp cavity is going to extend into the actual root or jawline. The apical foramen is going to be at the proximal end of the root, and it's going to be the entry for those blood vessels and nerves and things that are going to go into that tooth. The pharynx is going to be located between the oral cavity and the esophagus and the windpipe. The epiglottis is going to cover over the windpipe during swallowing, so no foods or liquids will get into the windpipe. The esophagus is going to be where it turns into the passageway for food from the pharynx to the stomach. And so it's going to use that peristalsis or rhythmic waves of muscular contractions in order to get that food from the top underneath that pharynx down to the stomach. And so this is going to be a cross section looking at the section of tissue at the point of that esophagus and the alimentary canal. And you can see that opening or white section is going to be the lumen, and then you see all the different layers that surround it. Now, the esophageal mucosa is going to be made up, of course, of the stratified squamous epithelium. Notice that is not keratinized because this is going to be inside of the body, so it'll be a nice moist section. Underneath it is going to be lined by the lamina propria, and then under that you have your muscularis mucosa. 3 stages of swallowing is going to be, first you have the food that's going to be chewed and mixed with the saliva. The tongue is then going to roll this mixture into a mass, which is known as a bolus or a food bolus, and then it's going to force it into the pharynx. The food in the pharynx is going to stimulate the swallowing reflex, and this is going to force that food into the esophagus. Next, peristalsis is going to take over, and it's going to work in these rhythmic wave-like motions to transport the food in the esophagus down into the stomach. And so here is just a visual. You chewed up the food, use the tongue, swallow it back. That food bolus starts to make its way down the pharynx and then goes through the esophageal sphincter. Once it goes in through there, it then hits the esophagus where peristalsis takes over and moves it to the stomach. So that first phase, as it's being swallowed, is referred to as the buccal phase, and that's going to begin with the compression of the bolus against the hard palate. Retraction of the tongue then is going to force the bolus into the oropharynx and assists in elevating the soft palate, thereby sealing off the nasopharynx so it doesn't go into the nose. Once the bolus enters the oropharynx, a reflex response begins, and that bolus is then going to be moved forward towards the stomach. The esophageal phase is going to begin as you have contractions of the pharyngeal muscles, and it's going to force that bolus through the entrance to the esophagus. So once it's in the esophagus, the bolus is then going to be pushed towards the stomach by peristaltic waves. Then it enters the stomach through that cardiac sphincter. So the approach of the bolus is going to trigger the opening of that lower esophageal sphincter, which we said was the cardiac, and then it's going to be able to enter into the stomach. This is where we're going to stop for today. We'll pick up with the stomach in part 2.